At the outset, I would like to acknowledge that Carleton University sits on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to Carleton University on behalf of the Faculty of Public Affairs and of Carleton's president, Alistair Summerlee. I would especially like to welcome our visitors from Europe, as well as speakers from Washington, British Columbia, Alberta, and Montreal. Carleton is honored to be hosting the new Jean Monnet Network on EU-Canada relations, the EU and Canada in Dialogue. And we're grateful for the generous support of the European Union for this endeavor. We're very proud that Carleton University is a leader in this area. Our Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and the Center for European Studies have become international hubs for research and discussions about Europe and its relationship to Canada. The Center for European Studies hosts a variety of projects, as Joan has mentioned, including 2 Jean Monnet chairs, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, and a EU-sponsored outreach project to high schools, among others. The Institute is also affiliated with the Center for Governance and Public Management and the Migration and Diaspora Studies Initiative here at Carleton. Today's energy workshop will enhance our understanding of not only this region, but the energy and climate policies that are quickly emerging from these. And now, they made the mistake of giving me 10 minutes. It's a bad idea. In part because in my previous life, I was an energy economist, interested in the interface between energy and the environment, and kind of really interested in Canadian energy policy issues. So you have to put up with a little bit of my telling you a story, and you can blame the organizers for all of this. In some sense, there are many parallels between Canada and the EU when it comes to energy and environmental policy space. There are many jurisdictions. Somehow it all has to fit together. The difference, in some sense, the new pan-Canadian framework on really highlights the differences between the EU and the Canadian Federation. And basically, if you think of this, what the framework calls for at some level is either provincial action or provincial and territorial action, but with a federal backstop. So if this doesn't happen, something else will happen in order to meet common goals. So as a result, there is not, as there would tend to be in the EU space, not a single policy, not a single approach to policy, but instead a multiplicity of ways of reaching what could be interpreted as the same goal, or same minimum goal. You can do better if you want, but you have to have a minimum goal. The problem with this, if you're in the energy or environmental sectors, right, is that you end up with large numbers of different sets of rules on this across jurisdictions within the Canadian Federation. So whether you're part of people interested in environmental aspects or you're more on the business side of the oil and gas industry, for example, then you're stuck with all of these rules all the time. As an economist, right, you sit there and you say, really, this is a cost increasing approach to dealing with the issue. So then the discussions about competitiveness and all of that kind of thing have to be taken into account, have to take into account that the mere notion of how we've chosen to approach this in the Canadian context will generate a higher cost of dealing with the issues than in places where you can actually agree on a common framework. As an economist, this is kind of not a good thing, as you can well imagine. But at least, on the other side, having railed on this issue for many years, you know, from an economics perspective, and so the other economists in the room can disagree, the fundamental issue of climate change is not a particularly difficult problem to understand. It's not a particularly difficult problem to model or to think of in an economics term. As I said, people can disagree. Where the problems have been in Canada have been largely political, largely because you have these interjurisdictional differences of interest because the types of activities within Canada are quite regionally based or determined. And so it creates this kind of trade-off, if you want, between doing something that is politically feasible and then doing something that is not too from an economics perspective, costly. We've found a trade-off, but we have to expect, finally, we've found a way of moving forward on these issues, but we have to expect that inherently the approaches that we will choose will be, from an economics perspective, not the lowest cost approaches. And that's something we're going to have to deal with. I would not finish this part of the remarks without telling you that the way things are set up now, notice, is that there is provincial action with a federal backstop. So you've got to think of this, what's the incentive system that is inherent in that kind of organization of a policy framework, as we discussed with not mine, others a little bit earlier, right? Essentially, you know, the federal government is on the hook. You can imagine yourself as a provincial government saying, why would I want to touch this? I can always blame Ottawa for anything that happens. And of course, in the Canadian context, you know, as I've written down, Ottawa bashing is second only to complaining about the weather as to something that Canadians want to do on a daily basis, that kind of thing. Now, I don't know how many of you were here yesterday, but there was big news yesterday. For those of you who are geeks like me about Canadian energy policy, a hugely ambitious project was announced by the federal government. And the hugely ambitious project is to, close down the National Energy Board, replace it with the Canadian Energy Regulator, much more focused on what we would think of as economic regulation, and then to close down the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency and replace it with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. Now this is where the geeky stuff comes in. In part why this is important is that the old legislation, or the legislation that supported the environmental agency, the SEA, had a provision in it that allowed other agencies to take over responsibility for impact assessment if they so desired, under certain characteristics. And that's where the NEB had moved over decades. Now, again, as an economist, you say, this is a weird place to be, because you've got kind of competing interests living within the same organization. And so that is all, again, if you want, the issue now is resolved from an incentive purpose within the two organized agencies. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, if this plays out. And now, just to give you a personal anecdote, in 2003-04, I was acting Assistant Deputy Minister for Energy at Natural Resources Canada. I spent most of my time trying to design or work with province stakeholders, which included the provinces, to design a process to evaluate energy project in Atlantic Canada. It's a long story. That was essentially one project, one assessment. The bun fights that this created were phenomenal, right? Because you had slightly different kinds of rules in Nova Scotia than you did in Newfoundland, than you did in New Brunswick, than you did in PEI. Everybody thought their system was better. It didn't quite work. We finally got there in the end, and then nobody built the project, so it's kind of unnecessary. But it is interesting to see that in the way it is presented, the functioning of this new Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, that is precisely what is driving it. One project, one assessment. So not only would you get the federal family lined up, Transport Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Environmental Canada, all of these groups lined up, but you would also then reach out to the provinces to do something jointly, I would imagine, if you do this kind of thing. Now, this is really exciting. It is really ambitious. It comes as a response to what both industry and environmental groups have been requesting, and indigenous peoples. Requesting might be the wrong word, but see pressures to move away, separate the roles, make the rules clearer, all of that kind of thing. We'll see how it works out from the concept to practice, and then how the practice actually evolves as part of implementation. Exciting times on the energy front. How then this will fit into Canada's climate policy, and in the next, the topic of the next session on low carbon transition will be an interesting file to watch over the next number of years. So there. So with that in mind, so I would thank you all for joining us today and for listening to me so politely. So it's now my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Peteris Ustubs, Ambassador of the Delegation of the European Union to Canada. Prior to his posting in Ottawa, Ambassador Ustubs served for 3 years as America's Senior Advisor to the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. He has held other senior level posts, including Director for West and Central Africa with the European External Action Service from 2012 to 2014. Ambassador Ustubs began his career in the Latvian diplomatic service in 1993 and served his country in several roles, including as member of the Latvian delegation to the European Union, as foreign policy advisor to the Latvian Prime Minister, and as policy director in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, as well as deputy head of cabinet for the European Commission, Commissioner of Development. Ambassador Ustubs, welcome.